Good evening. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues and students here this evening. I'm Deborah Crone, Chair of Academic Programs at BGC, and it's my pleasure to welcome this evening's speaker. Emanuele Lugli's work weaves together a number of seemingly disparate intellectual realms in uniquely creative ways. A historian of late medieval and early modern art by training and currently assistant professor of art history at Stanford, he explores broad questions concerning the structures of knowledge and power that inform systems and networks, drawing on the history of science and technology, as well as literature, religion, material, and visual culture. His first book of four, published in Italian in 2014, was a history of the impact of the metric system in Napoleonic Italy. A second book, The Making of Measure and the Promise of Sameness, published by the University of Chicago in 2019, looks at how the study of topography, urbanism, and architecture can illuminate current ideas about precision, truth, and objectivity, working backwards from the present in an ingenious and very readable format. To say. A third book, intriguingly titled Knots, or The Violence of Desire in Renaissance Florence, just out from Chicago, demonstrates how looking at hair in painting, poetry, sermons, and medical treatises can unravel attitudes about gender roles and unmask the thinly veiled bias inherent in traditional society and art from the 15th and 16th centuries. A fourth book, written with students in mind, is called Measuring the Renaissance, an Introduction, and just appeared this summer. A cascade of articles address aspects of these projects, such as one about the so-called pietre di paragone, stone templates visible on the streets of many Italian towns but hidden in plain sight, that served as public measures for cloth, bricks, and other commodities. Or Leonardo and the Hair Makers, or Fashion's Measure, Preaching, Chronicle Writing, and the New Look of the 1340s, and I could go on. Our topic this evening, which deals with cartography and mapping, leads me to acknowledge this place as Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and to recognize New York City as past, current, and future home for many indigenous people. Land acknowledgements honor customary indigenous protocols for the thanking of hosts and call attention to ongoing realities of colonial dispossession. We also remember and honor the essential contributions of others who traveled to these lands against their free will. And so to this evening's talk, part of our annual Early Modern World series, co-organized by myself and Andrew Morrow, in which Dr. Lugli will engage with another of his long-term research interests, the history of fashion and fashion studies. In addition to more scholarly articles on this, I see that he even used to write for Vogue Italia. So tonight, the topic is fashion's hard borders, as you see. So it's such a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Deborah, for these really terrific introductions. I mean, I do sound like awful, though. I mean, like, it sounds like I'm such an overachiever. So I'm like, maybe I'll relax after this. So, Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette begins with a carriage winding through the unknown. The coach is carrying the title character, the daughter of Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, here played by American actress Kristen Dunst, to her soon-to-be groom, the Dauphine of France. This is the journey of a future queen. As described by Antonia Fraser, whose biography Coppola adapted for the screen, the journey was long. It lasted around 2 weeks, with daily travel sessions lasting up to 9 hours. It did not end up in Paris, though, but she was welcomed by, as you can see here, the Count of Noailles, who, together with his wife, the Countess of Noailles, here played by Australian actress Judy Davis, instructs the Queen about what is about to happen. What is about to happen? There's a ceremony that is taking place, and the ceremony is called the handover. As Judy Davis explains once in the tent, the handover means that a princess from the empire needs to be stripped of all of her clothes and then put on clothes from her new country, which is France, so that she could enter the new ground, the new territory, as a French citizen. Sofia Coppola follows the historical records scrupulously. She just adds a touch of sentimentality, like in this scene where she says goodbye to her travel companions, and especially by the inclusions of a dog, which is taken from her. It's a shriek. Sentimentality actually quite is historically accurate, because we do know that Marie Antoinette left a lot of tears during the journey, so it's kind of like, historically accurate. But the interesting things, and what I think it shows actually Coppola's being a great director, is that Marie Antoinette is actually only stripped of clothes. She's stripped of the very layers of clothes while her face becomes progressively more jaded. She removes all elements that classify in a way as a teenager. She remains completely naked. And the only item of clothing that is added is this blue ruffled cage, this panier. And then after which she leaves the tent, as a French woman. And you can see also the camera work has changed. This becomes a still symmetrical view, which is basically the cinematographic equivalent of whatever. Coppola does not show it, but the handover took place on an island on the Rhine, situated half the way between the French city of Strasbourg and the town of Kiel in the Holy Roman Empire. The island was chosen because it stood on the Rhine, which in 1770, when Marie Antoinette left Austria, was the official border between the two countries. Leaving royal daughters on the border had become common practice. In 1739, the daughter of the King of France, Louis XV, went through a handover ceremony in the Pyrenees between France and Spain before marrying the second son of Philip V. Researcher Christian Köster has done more than anyone else to reconstruct the long history of nuptial journeys, which date back to the Middle Ages. Yet, the change of fashion seems to be an early modern construct. The first instance was recorded in 1475, when Hedwig of Poland was required to wear a German dress when marrying the Duke of Bavaria in Landshut. Similarly, the Milanese Bianca Maria Sforza was asked to dress in the German style during the wedding of Emperor Maximilian I in 1494. And here on screen, there are two paintings that record the fashion shift. On the left is Giovanni Antonio de Predi's famous pre-marriage portrait, which is today in Washington. And on the right, there is Bianca Maria Sforza's portrait by Bernhard Striegel in Vienna, showing her in imperial clothing. Please pay attention to these 15th century dates, 1475 and 1498, as they will become more important later. In the following century, the bride's clothing was changed not at the ceremony, but during the journey. This is the case of Anna d'Este in 1548. She left the paternal court in Ferrara in Italian clothes, but arrived in Paris in French clothes. In 1660, Maria Theresa of Spain, betrothed to King Louis XIII, also left Madrid in Spanish fashion, but during the trip she acquired French clothing. It is not clear when the shift took place. The sources are silent on this aspect, but we know that by then a handover ceremony was in place and that it took place on the border. In 1615, Anna of Austria and Elizabeth of France, respectively the future brides of Louis XIII and Philip IV of Spain, were exchanged across the Bidassoa River. This Bidassoa River, which is in the Basque Country, which then marked the border between France and Spain. So even these brief excursus show that during the 3 centuries, from 1475 to Marie Antoinette's wedding in 1770, there was a progressive convergence of fashion changes and border crossing, whose proximity I aim to explore in tonight's lecture, because I do not think it is a coincidence. As a way to start, let's take the map of the African states that you encountered in the advertisement for this talk. It is flanked by depictions of costumed African people, for the map is a product of the reciprocity of borders and costumes. It was printed by the world-famous cartographer William Blau in his new atlas of 1641-1642. Early modern atlases were often referred to as new because they updated information from previous maps. In this case, however, new also refers to the innovative framing of a map with costume figurines. This new typology was introduced some 30 years earlier by the renowned Dutch geographer Juste Hont. And 30 years, as you know, is brief in the world of 17th century cartography. I mean, even today in academia, we think books from 1994 are fairly recent. This typology became quickly widespread. It returns from cartographic works meant to be disseminated, such as the popular atlas, the so-called Atlas Minor of Claes Vischer, to late 17th century Japanese maps, which were influenced by Portuguese cartography. Around 10 years ago, scholars rejected the idea that those borders were merely decorative. As the Japanese map shows well, the costumed figurines are equal in importance to the geographical representation of the territory. As maps highlighted political territories, thus showing them as definitive and defined, so costume figurines spoke of the existence of a homogeneous group of people who lived within those borders. The costume figurines, in a way, legitimize the existence of borders. Borders tell you where people live. At the same time, borders legitimize the need for costumes. Since they were not marked in the ground, it is mostly through the change in fashion that you could experience being among different people, which means that you crossed a border. It's people with different costumes and resources, right? So costumes and maps, in other words, were mutually reinforcing. And as historians Giorgio Riello and Giulia Calvi have shown, these maps came into being because they fused two distinct representations of the world, the costume books and the atlases. So costume books are collections of illustrations depicting figures in the fashion of one state. Often, a state is reduced to one or a couple of figures, usually gendered. Such collections emerged in the middle of the 16th century, the first ones being Eneavico Diversarum Gentium Nostrae Aetatis Habitus of 1558, and especially François Desherbes' Recueil de la Diversité des Habits, published in 1562, which you can see now on the screen. Some collections can be anticipated to the 1520s, but they do not have the exhaustiveness of later collections, nor their success. So they're smaller, sometimes it's just about religious orders. It is only around the 1550s that this collection exploded. 216 costume books were published between 1558 and 1610, which is the year when these illustrations start appearing on the border of maps. The history of costume books then coincided with the history of atlases. In 1513, Ptolemy's ancient treatise, the Geography, was published in Strasbourg and thus led to a revamped interest in maps. Yet, as Jean-Marc Besse has reconstructed, a veritable map boom only happened between the 1550s and 1560s. Two booksellers were largely responsible for this: Antonio Lefreri in Rome and Francesco Tramezzino in Venice. These two booksellers sold independent sheets representing contemporary states. But then, as you can see here, the map of Ireland, for instance, by Lafreri. But then, around 1570, Lafreri, who was really a Burgundian printer, who emigrated to Italy and not an Italian citizen, decided to gather numerous maps in book form. It did not matter that they had been engraved by different people or that some had borders and others didn't. He bound what he found, what he had available in his bookshop. The great historians of cartography, David Woodward, calls these publications cartographic anthologies, for they had no text, similarly to other types of printed anthologies, such as those about natural history, like the stones and minerals, or about numismatics. But in 1570, the geographer Abraham Ortelius published a modern atlas, the so-called Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, which included maps that had been all drawn for the occasion by relying on the latest evidence. Ortelius acted on a criticism of Mercator, the famous cartographer, who lamented that the Italians merged erroneous and counterfeited maps with authentic and exact ones into a single entity, without order, without respect for the proportions, without judgment. Ortelius personally fetched information to improve his maps and provided new plates so to provide the best available evidence. Ortelius' atlas enjoyed immediate Europe-wide success. It was published in 31 editions by 1612. Overall, Ortelius' atlas sold around 7,300 copies, which is a lot for those times. His compilation was not only reliable, it was also efficient. He called it a theater because the term was used to indicate a work in which a lot of data was concentrated within a small space, so as to make it readily available at a glance. It was a compression tool, and as historian Paula Findlen has stressed, its purpose was to study, and we know that people did, for instance, by calculating the distance between towns and thus the cost of traveling and shipping goods. The atlas was a tool of study not only because it provided a lot of graphic information, but also because it introduced every map with a textual description. Interestingly, this is a feature the costume books had introduced and which then reflected back to costume books. Cesare Vecellio's publication Degli abiti antichi e moderni di diverse parti del mondo of 1590 is a sort of translation of Ortelius' atlas in the form of a costume book. The plates have been redrawn to be consistent, each region is introduced by a text, and with 428 engravings, it aims at being comprehensive. So, geographical atlases and costume books developed hand in hand, influencing each other and shaping perceptions of the world together. This convergence of intents did not escape contemporary readers. Historian Michel Mosley Christian has drawn our attention to the preface of Jean-Jacques Boissard's 1581 costume books, Habitus Variorum Orbitus Gentium, which really means various costumes of the people of the world. I quote a passage from it. As many books are written and illustrated with copper plates that portray the various regions and the towns of the different regions for the use of those who have learned about the world by studying these maps, I am convinced that this book is also useful work. This book shows human dress according to the usage of the individual people, and in that way, it can be easily seen how one region differs from the other. This was a bit like stating the obvious, because 16th century people knew they could identify individuals based on what they wore. The Venetian writer Francesco Sansovino recalls that Venetians were easily distinguishable from foreigners, since all Venetians dressed alike, as if, I quote, were part of a religious order, end quote. And while travelers and merchants could put on local garments in order to try to pass for local citizens, this was never the case for people in governmental roles. So, Sansovino recommended looking at the clothing of politicians and officers as representatives of the cultures of the place. He recalls, for instance, how Florentine officers had to wear the lucco, a short black tunic open to the sides, as you can see in this famous portrait by Machiavelli. Fashion was particularly integral to state identity, and it is in this line of thinking that, in his costume book, Vecellio blames the quick nature of fashion for contributing to the dissolution of states. This is amazing. States, he writes, have nothing left but their names, since people, especially royals and aristocrats who learn about the world's culture through atlases and these very costume books, started borrowing elements from one country to another because they saw themselves as universal men, as universal citizens. Vecellio's words are telling because fashion does not simply reflect the fall of the world, but is responsible for it. Vecellio presents it as profoundly intertwined with politics and thus cast an almost nostalgic light onto his own book. His book shows us that the world, what the world should look like, what its neat divisions between cultures that cling to their traditional core, and not, what the world around him is, because it's a mess. People are dressing, borrowing out items from anything, right? So the world should look like this, and he's hoping to change people's perceptions with this, basically what is a conservative costume atlas. By doing so, he pokes a hole into the coupling of cartography and costume books. What you see here, he seems to say, is not real, but is what the world should look like. But fashion and cartography are not united simply by the shared chronology of atlases and costume books. In my opinion, it is not just a matter of a coincidence or a convergence of political fantasies of enclosed homogeneity. Rather, they are the results of the same body of knowledge, which is geometria pratica, a branch of maths that is no longer extant today, but was extremely compact from the Middle Ages until the 19th century. The expression practical geometry was first recorded in an anonymous French treatise of the 12th century titled Pratique de géométrie, even though its basic operations can be traced back to the ancient Greek and Roman treatises. These operations allow one to measure anything in the real world. Here's an example of how to measure the height of a tower without having a crane. You need to stick an arrow in the ground and place a piece of wax where the roof of the tower in the distance intersects the arrow in front of your eyes. That's point C. Once you've done that, you can find the proportions between the height of the wax bit and its distance from you, and apply the same proportions between the height of the tower and the distance between you and the tower. It works because both triangles are similar since they share the same angles. So then what you do, you measure the distance between you and the arrow and the segment of the arrow between B and C, and then you measure the distance between you and the tower, and you can tell how tall the tower is, right? Practical geometry is often considered a measuring manual, but to be more precise, it is really a sort of treatise that deals with problems of translating three-dimensional volumes into two-dimensional shapes. The three-dimensional world is transformed, therefore, in bidimensional, that is, geometrical elements. In doing so, this branch of mathematics helped both cartographers to represent the outlines of their territories, but it also helped tailors to construct wearable garments out of flat fabric. One way to start visualizing the relationship is by examining two 18th century treatises, Giuseppe Antonio Alberti, in relation to Leon Battista Alberti, Istruzioni pratiche per l'ingegnero civile of 1748, which is really a manual to teach surveying, and François de Gersault, L'Art du Tailleur, a treatise on tailoring. On the left, you see here an irregular shape divided into sections. The surveyor is interested in knowing the perimeter of the field he has been assigned, but since he also wants to determine its area, he needs to project every protruding point onto the central vertical axis. This allows him to turn a complex shape into more manageable, easier to calculate surfaces, basically compounds of rectangles and triangles, and as I hope everyone knows, a rectangle is two triangles, right? Okay. On the right, instead, you see the constructions of the tail of a redingote as a fan of four triangles that all share the same vertex. Here, a complex form is also constructed by the addition of simpler geometrical shapes. So tailoring and surveying are both expressions of the art of measuring. A tailor takes measurements from a body and translates them onto a piece of fabric. Similarly, a surveyor takes measurements of a field and reproduces them on a sheet of paper, usually at a scale. By measuring, both transform a real body into dimensions. They also simplify reality. Grass and body hair are gone. They ignore the occasional gusts and cuffs, presenting the objects as straightforward, lifeless quantities. This is the first, simplest connections of tailoring and map making, turning a three-dimensional thing into a set of measurements. I think we can notice this overlapping reliance on geometry when we look at the 14th century representations of a tailor selling clothes, which are made, as I think you can see, of compounds of circles and trapezoidal shapes. Then, when we look at the surveying manuals of the time, they also divide up fields in a similar ways. What you see on the right is Bartolus of Sassoferrato's legal treatise on how to calculate the areas of fields. It was written in the 14th century, just before these illuminations, right? But then it became so popular they kept reprinting it up to the end of the 16th century. In fact, the edition, as you can see on the screens, is a French one published in 1518. The use of geometry, however, structures both cartography and tailoring also at an invisible level. For instance, before drawing a map or cutting the pieces for a garment, surveyors and tailors had to get a sense of the overall body or the territory. For instance, surveyors did so by measuring the lands, turning it into a set of triangles. Surveyors achieved this by connecting distant trees, towers, and mountaintops. After creating an imaginary triangle and recording the dimensions in a diary, basically, they traveled to a vertex of that triangle and used it as a starting point to create another triangle, and then another triangle, and then another triangle, until you create a whole system of imaginary triangles. That's, Great Britain and Ireland on the right. And that's what surveyors call triangulation, which is a sort of invisible skeleton of a map. This preliminary phase was needed, right? Because then you write outlines and you position cities according to this grid, right, of triangles. This operation, however, was also needed because it helped to orient any measurements in relationship to the north, okay? So in a way, this is a form of grounding. Now, tailors relied on a very similar process. Since the Middle Ages, they also measured the clients' bodies, searching not for towers but for protuberances, such as the end of a shoulder or an elbow, as you can see in these illuminations from the 14th century, where the tailor is lifting the cloth because he's searching for the elbow of the client. And therefore, they created a network of dimensions that often relied on triangles, as you can see on the right. And because they tried to turn a body into dimensions, regardless of whether they needed those dimensions to then make the garments, right? So this is, again, becomes a sort of invisible grid, like in cartography, where you cannot recognize the points that served as a reference for the constructions of the maps. In fashion, you don't necessarily see the invisible networks that give shapes to a pattern, right? So there's a sort of invisible body that they have to construct. Additionally, every outfit built on this invisible system is also oriented to the vertical posture of the body, providing a form of grounding, and that's used for all sorts of, way for draping, basically. So, both cartography and tailoring technically rely on two sets of measurements. First, the invisible triangulation, let's call it that way. And two, the actual measurements, which are anchored on the invisible grid and produce either the cartographical outlines you see on maps or the edges of the clothes. It is perhaps unsurprising that in Italy, the surface of the earth in the Renaissance was called the manto terrestre, the geological mantle. And as if planet Earth were wrapped in cloth, which geographers were summoned to describe. This is an ancient idea. Already in the 5th century, before the current era, a Greek legend reproduced by the Greek mythographer Pherecydes of Cyrus says that the earth and the seas came into being because Zeus, the light god, had them embroidered on a mantle. The legend was popularized by Macrobius in his commentary on the dream of Scipio, a fundamental text of geography and Neoplatonic ideas, which compared both the skies and the earth to a clock. But once it was put out there, it was quickly put to use as evidence in the wrappings of medieval kings, in mantles dotted with stars and constellations, and in this gorgeous early modern clock in Nuremberg, embroidered with a landscape. Echoes of this well-known myth shaped the making of the very first globe, constructed by Merten Behem, a textile merchant from Nuremberg around 1492. It is an exceptional object, and thanks to diary entries, we know quite a lot about its constructions. The spherical shell was shaped around a mold by layering together sheets of paper to form a pasteboard. After it was coated with whiting, the makers applied vellum cut in the shape of gorse, which had been painted with a map of the world. In the bottom of the screen, you see what the globe looked like before being pasted onto the spherical mold. However, want to stress, the gores were the wedges the tailors employed to widen skirts and sleeves. And here on the screen, you see an example of a work in late 15th century manual, right? This is considered the greatest tailoring innovations of the Middle Ages. These little patches, right, that helps to widen skirts and sleeves and improve mobility. Behem would have known them since he was a textile merchant, after dealing with tailors who knew how to move, again, from a bidimensional surface to a three-dimensional object. The first globe makers were all tailors. That's the amazing thing, because you need to know how to construct a three-dimensional object out of, paper, basically. A couple of other points. The invisible grid was not always needed. So this kind of work was not always needed. In fact, it was hardly ever implemented. Only the most scrupulous professionals produced it, and most cartographers simply copied already available maps, which they used to add their innovations, right? Similarly, tailors, after just measured the clothes of their clients, which they reproduced, they didn't have to measure the bodies from scratch, right? Which is very time-consuming. In the Venetian comedy La Serva Padrona, which I would translate the bullying maid, a character tries to pass for wealthier than he is and goes to a tailor demanding to have all the measurements of his body taken, as they do in France. The tailor has no idea what to reply or what to do, and so he starts blabbering random numbers, pretending that he's taking measurements. Even in an earlier play from the 1690s, La Santa Zita by Giacomo Rossi, a tailor is described as singular, which really means anal, because he decides to measure the body of a client before cutting the clothes. Apparently that was a great laugh at the time. Second point, throughout the early modern period, both tailors and cartographers tried to simplify surveying and tailoring by reducing the number of points needed for a map or an outfit to be made. In 1720, and I think this is a great telling kind of anecdote, members of the Académie des Sciences of Paris, the most prestigious scientific academy in the world at the time, which is mostly made of cartographers and physicists, sat through a session during which a master tailor known as Disse showed them how to construct a justacorp in 6 cuts rather than the traditional 21. The event, which is part of an ongoing discussions in the academy about efficiency, especially industrial efficiency, was recorded in Gersol's treatise on the art of tailoring that I mentioned before, right? But it's fascinating that scientists are witnessing what is basically a tailoring session, right? And they're providing advice to tailors, and they want to learn from tailors on how to improve the geometry, the constructions of basically maps. They think that there's like a shared knowledge between them, which was accepted. Can you imagine today a physicist speaking to a fashion designer? I mean, it's I just think it's amazing, right? So Many other treatises afterwards tried to reach similar conclusions, as shown, for instance, on this image, which is from the late 19th century, which tells you how you can simplify the constructions of a coat, right? From a lot of measurements, as you can see on the top right, to very few measurements at the bottom right? And cartographers are doing kind of the same things, just want to be faster. This activity is so time-consuming and laborious that they need to find a ways to make it quicker, right? Otherwise, they cannot map the world as they want to. So I've shown a few ways in which tailoring and surveying practices overlapped. And there are, of course, also points of divergence, right? But I'm not the only one who caught them. In fact, early modern people often made remarks about their similarities. 17th century preacher Romolo Marchelli criticizes tailors because they believed to be mathematicians. And surveyors also called themselves mathematicians, by the way. The earliest historical admission of the connections of fashion and geometry comes, in my opinion, in 1464 by the German astronomer Johannes Müller, that is better known as Regiomontanus. Müller was an astronomer, was asked to give the opening lecture of the academic year at the University of Padua in that year. And what does he say? So, it was the end of July, the sun in the house of Cancer, and Müller started conventionally by explaining the origins of geometry. Etymologically, geometry was the measure of the earth. It was believed to have been developed by the Egyptians in response to the problem of restoring the boundaries of their fields after the regular floods of the river Nile. Müller explains that the Egyptians recorded the boundaries by measuring the sides of the fields and finding ways to cross-check those distances, but also measuring other things, such as their diagonals. Those practices caught the attentions of one of Socrates' students, Euclid, who reworked the know-how of the Egyptians since he found it too raw. And the word Müller employs is indigestium, which is indigestible. And then Euclid produced a book in 13 chapters which systematized all geometrical knowledge. It came to be known as the Elements since Müller thought it provided the foundations for understanding the physics of the world. As you all know, in the Middle Ages, geometry was one of the 4 subjects of the quadrivium, and thus at the very same level as arithmetics, music, and astronomy. Yet Müller reorganized, in the middle of this introductory lecture, the 4 subjects hierarchically, emphasizing geometry as the prime mathematical discipline, the one that provided the elements for the other 3 and those of all practices. Geometry was not just useful, but necessary for mechanics, architecture, instrument making, and also tailoring. Knowledge of the content of the lecture reached 16-year-old Luca Pacioli, who was then a student of mathematics in Venice, which is 15 miles out of Padua, and 30 years later repeated the gist of Müller's point in his best-selling book that is titled The Summa di Aritmetica Geometria, Proporzione e Proporzionalità. This is the best-selling accounting book of the Renaissance. Like Regiomontanus, there he writes that, I quote, "Proportions is the mother and queen of all of them, and you could not practice any of them without her, it is geometry." But even more interesting is what he writes afterwards. He writes, "Geometry is pervasive in tailoring. You find it in their cuts, regardless of whether they are tunics, mantles, doublets, coats, and any other type of clothing. Neither styling nor demeanor can make up for clothes that are not cut according to the right proportions. And this is why we used to say that a mantle of that size needs to be that width and requires cloth of that height. It is something we say also of sewing, as each stitch needs to conform to that distance and have that tension, as both qualities are also an effect of certain proportions. Even the stitching needs to be geometrically regulated. Geometry, a discipline for measuring estates, is here taken to aspirationally provide the rules for the entire art of tailoring, from sewing to cutting." So Müller and Pacioli seems to speak as if tailors did not know geometry, but I'm not sure this is the case. Instead, they may be encouraging, let's try to take a positive outlook here. Let's say that they know nothing about tailoring. They think they're being so innovative. In reality, they don't know the tailor is already doing that, but they want to push them to go farther, right? They want to encourage tailors to approach geometry with more consistency and to fully utilize its advantages. And the main advantage of geometry is that it's immutable. As geometrical shapes remain constant regardless of time and across space. The famous Italian thinker Leon Battista Alberti thought that immutability was the most important characteristic of measuring, so much so that he writes, you could sculpt half the statue in Tuscany and half of it in Greece, and then when you bring them together, they won't match. Which is, by the way, is not really true. Anyway, still, Müller and Regiomontano's ideas found their fullest expression in the 16th century with the introductions of pattern books. The first recorded surviving one dates back to the 1540s. It's in Milan, even if today it's in Venice. And this is only matched by one from a tailor in Wrocław, which started in the 1540s, but probably was finished in 1567. However, these volumes are private. They're an attempt to preserve knowledge about making that was not meant to be divulged, right? So this is what you give to your students, your assistants, and so on. It was only in 1580 that the first pattern book was published, and given its novelty, it's not surprising that its author Juan del Sega, felt the need to add an explanation for why no one had published a book of patterns before. First, he writes, it is necessary to submit the work to different judgments. Then there's another reason, which is there are many who for our sins take great delight in chastising the writer rather than acknowledging the goodwill with which he writes. Alsega makes it sound as if the world of tailors was rife with gossip and lots of opinions, right? But the truth is that printed pattern books did not need to exist. Each professional, after all, was interested in keeping their secrets. They developed patterns over a long time and had no interest in sharing them with anyone outside of their business. So why does he publish them? The tailor Agostino da Gubbio, the personal clothing maker for the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Eleonora da Toledo, confessed that he developed patterns to make clothes while the Grand Duchess of Tuscany was away. Distance is essential to explain the existence because in the 16th century, fashion was not something that could be shipped left and right. It was local. Since the Middle Ages, tailors could not work outside of their cities. So you need to get those clothes made in that specific spot. They're not going to ship them to you unless you're the lord or from city. And sometimes they ship hats, and that's about it. So, it was only when such local barriers were lifted, and there was a need to lift those barriers, that tailors started, which is when tailors started traveling basically, that they looked at patterns employed by other traveling artists, for instance, architects. Here on the screens, you find Michelangelo's famous Modani, which are patterns he produced to ensure the stonemasons respected his design for the San Lorenzo sacristy in Florence after he left for Rome in probably 1524, sorry. So, on the frontispiece of Juan del Sega's book, a tailor is depicted as a geometer holding a compass, standing next to a ruler and a piece of chalk or perhaps soap. The fact that the tailor holds a compass instead of the scissors of his trade turns this engraving into a manifesto, a way to convince readers that tailors are one with geographer. Here Alsega presents himself as another Mercator, the greatest cartographer of the 16th century, the author of a system of projections that we still employ for our maps today. The rest of the manual makes use of geometrical conventions to present an infallible standardization of outfits, that is, fashion. Following the conventions of artisans that are struggling to elevate their disciplines, scholars have read Alsega as a sort of new Michelangelo, struggling for reputation. But as Hyatt Mayer suggested here in New York already in 1942, the existence of printed books has something to do with the need to provide all tailors operating across the Spanish Empire with patterns for clothes so that they could standardize dressing. So basically that ambassadors in today Mexico and in Madrid look the same. So if they're traveling people between them, they could recognize who's who. Printed pattern books are the fulfillment of the idea of standardizations contained in the costume books, and that, as we saw, are aspirational representations of the uniformity of states. Alsega's 81 patterns were also a product of governmental legislation. They had been sanctioned by the royal tailors and drawn up following sumptuary legislation issued by the crowns. This usually tells you how much fabric you can use to make garments, right? Alsega, after all, expressed all the dimensions of this garment in the new royal L or var, as you can see on the top right, which is a length of 84 centimeters, and then employed a system of symbols to indicate how many varas of fabrics were to be used. The triple Q, which has been misplaced, it's good. The triple Q, for instance, indicates 3/4 of a vara. You can see triple Qs a little bit everywhere, right, on the pattern book. Through measuring, governments regulated fashion. This tradition began in the Middle Ages. The early surviving regulations of the tailors' guilds in Venice and Siena, dating back to the early 13th century, rely on quantification and measurements to dictate the borders the tailors could not trespass. The most common regulation states that, to determine the quantity of fabric tailors could use, the length of the trains of the women's tunics should not drag on the ground for more than 1 braccio, which is the local standards of measurements, which is approximately 2 feet. These directives are for tailors to follow when creating garments for their clients, and they speak the language of measurements, which is values that can be quantified, but also is knowledge. They speak of measurements because they know that tailors are already measuring garments, right? So they're trying to speak the language of tailors when doing so. Scholars have stressed that the train was being addressed because in the medieval city, anything that occupied public space was regulated. The gutters of the houses, the sloping roof, signs, all of these tiny architectural elements were forbidden because they were invasions of public space that ought then to be fiercely protected. The train of women's tunics was just such an invasion. And by presenting the issues in those terms, we enter the world of surveying. And I know it sounds crazy, but we have trials of women that had to go to court because their trains was occupying public space, right? There's a famous case of a woman wearing a green tunic. Her name is Francesca, who had to go to court 3 times in order to plead. And so eventually she wins, but it's a lot. So we are entering the world of surveying through fashion. And the world of surveying, primary goals was the defense of some properties, but indicating what elements were protruding onto it. So controlling the dimensions of clothing, at least at the beginning, was a way to control space. After all, where else did the government apply the same metric logic of the sumptuary laws? Where else do they find this kind of logic that they apply to the trains of women's clothes? To the definition of borders. The first demarcations of borders, as far as I know, comes in 1473. At that time, the lords of Mantua and Ferrara decided to represent their territory and fix the border between them. On the screen is the map that Ortelius designed almost a century later. As you can see on the left, what a mess the borders are. So, this 1473 surveying was undertaken by Luca Fancelli, the engineer in the service of the Gonzaga family, the rulers of Mantua, and Pietro Benvenuti, that is the architect working for the court of Ferrara. We have all the letters. And so this is for me is important because the borders start being demarcated graphically in some form, in written form, in maps that these lords have. Notice 1473, right? You remember the 2 dates I told you at the beginning, right? This is also the beginning where, future queens are asked to change clothes, perhaps when trespassing the borders. It's because borders are being defined in this very period. But there is more. This is also really the time where costume books really start emerging, because the earliest compilations of costumes that I found is this manuscript in Paris Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which was made around 1490, but we cannot date it. Actually, I think these pictures are maybe slightly later, which includes 20 depictions of costumes, such as the Neapolitan one that you see on the left and the Florentine one on the right. These women do not only typify and thus standardize local costumes, but they also are firmly planted on the territory with boundaries. You see how cute it is? They're part of a territory, right? As historian John Gagné has shown, the album was made to celebrate Philippe de Gueldre, the mistress of King Charles VIII, who is the only one represented on a horse. It is a move to express not only her magnificence. The caption reads that she has a proud bearing and a merry countenance, but also to show that she has been traveling and thus can appropriate elements from other countries. As you can see, she has the Neapolitan sleeves and she's got the Florentine fabric on her. So she inaugurates what basically rulers started doing, which is appropriating elements to everything, and therefore leads to the dissolutions of states, according to Cesare Vecellio, right? So tailoring in this case is defined in relation to borders. And this simple maxim could not be represented better than a popular story of the early modern period, that of Dido's founding on Carthage, thanks to an ox hide. According to this legend, Princess Dido, fleeing her murderous brothers Pygmalion from the city of Tyre, landed on the shores of North Africa. There she met King Jarbas, who offered to sell her as much land as the hide of a bull could cover. And it was like, stupid woman, what can you possibly cover with that? And undaunted, she accepted, and together with her subjects, she cut the ox hide into very long and thin strips, which she then tied together to form an extremely long band of oxhide. With this, she marked the boundaries of a large region against the shoreline, and there she founded the city of Carthage, of which she became queen. The story was summarized in a few verses by Virgil in the first book of Aeneid, but was recounted with many more details by Titus, Livius, and Justin in ancient times, and then again in the early modern period by many chroniclers such as Giovanni Fabbrini. Still, the story was illustrated, which is the real marker of fame. In these French manuscripts of Boccaccio's book on famous women, today in the Morgan Library here in New York, an illumination represents the two moments of the legend. At the bottom are the surveyors encircling the area, right? But at the top, you find the tailors cutting the ox hides according to the instructions of Dido. In a way, both these elements are contributing to constructions of the world. And in a way, in this map of Africa, I think it's great because you find tailors and geographers similarly contributing to the definitions, in this case of a continent. But they're collaborating together to construct the world. These 15th century illuminations was adapted in a copper plate by the Swiss engraver Matthaus Merian the Elder for the historical chronicle by the theologian Johann Ludwig Gottfried, which was one of the most widely read books of the 17th and the 18th centuries, which is really when the myth exploded. And we have countless Venetian representations of Dido with the ox hide, but they're not very good. Goethe, famously, was a fan of Gottfried Chronicles, this very chronicle. He read the edition that was finished being printed in 1759, which is a decade before Marie Antoinette arrived in Strasbourg in 1770, an event he witnessed because Goethe was in Strasbourg studying law at the time. An intriguing commentator, a theologian, Giovanni Ambrogio, posits that Dido can be viewed as the ultimate monarch, akin to all great rulers, for she had created a state contained by one continuous line, which is a critique to the many feudal countries that are made of disconnected parcels of territory, which pose challenges in communication and in population homogenization. Furthermore, Ambrogio says that Dido got inspired to cut the hide into strips by her knowledge of the world, which, according to Ovid but also Macrobius, whose treatise you can see again on the screens, is telling you that you should divide the world into strips, right? Because the world is divided into strips. Today we call them like as climate zones, right? You can see the torrid, the temperate ones, and so on. But there are many different divisions that are natural to the world. So he thinks, this commentator, that Dados got the idea from this type of knowledge, right, and applied it to tailoring. In England, the word fashion is thought to have derived from fashion, a term indicating the making of something. Sometimes it's spelled fashion, an attempt to bring it closer to the Latin etymology of facio, which means I make. Fashion, however, is mostly employed to talk about the form of the earth and the sky. In William Tyndale's Bible of 1534, the book that shaped the English language and spearheaded the Protestant Reformation, we can read in 1 Corinthians 7:31 that for the fashion of this world goes away, and in Matthew 16:3 we can read, "Oh, you hypocrites, you can discern the fashion of the sky, and can you not discern the signs of the times?" This information may be sufficient to see, perhaps for the first time, the textile-like quality of the maps of the first time of the 16th century. They appear as if they were sails being blown by the wind, or as if they were half-sewn pieces of fabric cut into shapes. They look like sleeves. They're about to be, to become a garment. Historians of cartography refer to these early printed maps as cordiform, meaning heart-shaped, but they often forget that the term was actually coined by the French mapmaker Laurence Finet only in 1550. And that's he did when he shipped a map into a heart for allegorical purposes. At the start of the 16th century, there was a significant diversity in how maps were presented because the relationship between maps and clothing was both technical and commonplace. Yet perhaps an even clearer way to see the connections between fashion and state territory is expressed by those maps that represent the geography of Europe as a queen clothed in aristocratic finery. Perhaps they express better than anything else how the hems of clothing politically coincided with the geographical borders, for they were both expressions of geometry, practical geometry, which is nothing else but an attempt to control space. These maps continue well into the 20th century, when the connections of fashion and territorial borders did not stop. And it is not perhaps a bad idea to conclude with these territorial, ironically shaped territories like clothed figures to make one final point. The overlaps of fashion and cartography may appear interesting, perhaps even surprising, but what I think is important here is that by bringing cartography into fashion studies, we actually can approach fashion studies differently. Historians write the history of fashion by examining costume books and pattern books. They often foreground their ideological, fantastical dimension, but they stick to the material without realizing how problematic this material is. Since the 19th century, geographers, especially German geographers, have posited that maps distort the perceptions of the Earth. Real geography, that is human geography, has nothing to learn from the reductivist operations of the maps, which are systems of symbols, conventional representations of political will, not real documents to understand how humans and the environment work. Maps are often attempts to manipulate the world, not to understand it. Because as representation of the world, they're extremely poor. As far as I can see, fashion historians have not put forward a similar critique. But costume books, tailoring patterns, are also maps. Therefore, we should not take them at face value. If we do so, we will only write a history of the aspirations of power over bodies. That is, we will mistake the map for the place. So I think that fashion historians should listen to the advice of geographers. After all, fashion and geography have been living in symbiosis for 8 centuries. Thank you.